Asterisk asterisk. America once believed that if it was strong enough, every question would simply disappear. But after fear fades, what lingers the longest is doubt. That doubt did not come from the outside. It came from within. And that is where this story begins. Asterisk asterisk. After September 11th, America did not collapse. It stood up, not through a miracle, not through forgetting, but through an ancient human reflex when struck hard, to grip whatever remains and try to breathe. But standing up does not mean returning to who you were. In the days that followed, America's atmosphere took on a strange color, part mourning, part resolve. Flags appeared everywhere, as if strips of red, white, and blue could somehow stitch together an invisible tear that had opened inside the nation. On windows, on cars, on wrists, on lapels, the flag became a reminder, we are still here. In public squares, people stood closer together. Strangers embraced one another, quick, trembling hugs, but real. Churches filled. Candles burned through the night. Prayers rose like the breath of someone waking from a nightmare, not fully understanding yet, but knowing they had nearly lost everything. On television, speeches played on repeat. Voices low and steady, filled with heavy words, unity, strength, justice. Cameras swept across crowds holding photos of the missing, red-rimmed eyes, clenched hands. Everything seemed to say the same thing, we will endure. And yes, America endured. But in quiet kitchens after the news ended, when dinner plates were still warm, when children had fallen asleep, when the television volume dropped and finally went dark, what remained was not a slogan. What remained was silence. In a suburb, a father sat for a long time at the table, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. He had believed the world was divided into two clear places, here and elsewhere. Here was safe. Elsewhere was war, instability, stories you watched and then turned off. But now that line was gone. Here could be reached. Here could fall. In a cramped city apartment, a young woman flipped through the photos on her wall friends' family weekend trips. She looked at her own smiling face from the past and felt as if she were staring at a stranger, a girl who had never known fear, never known the feeling of sirens tightening the chest for no clear reason, never known what it meant to step onto a subway and scan every face, searching for a sign. In a classroom, a teacher tried to continue the lesson as usual, but at one loud noise in the hallway, the entire class froze. The children didn't have words for the feeling, but they sensed it. The adults had changed. And when adults change, the world changes with them. Americans had united, yes. But that unity was not only love. It was shared confusion, shared questions, a shared fracture running beneath every promise. Because if this was not a battlefield, if this was not a border, then why did it happen here? People began looking back at the years before, like reopening a diary long ignored. Decisions that had been made, wars that had been entered, warnings that had been dismissed, signs that had been overlooked. The question was no longer only who did this. A more dangerous question emerged. Why? In bars, conversations grew heavier. At family dinners, questions surfaced more often, not to argue, but to hold on to something. Because when you don't understand what has happened, you try to understand it as a form of survival. And behind the sea of flags, behind the echoing speeches, behind the slogans repeated like protective charms, one quiet question slipped into every home, every conversation. A question no one wanted to ask, but everyone carried. What did we do to let this happen? Americans began to doubt things they had never doubted before. That doubt did not arrive like an explosion. It didn't shake buildings or tear the sky apart. It came quietly, like a cold draft slipping through a cracked door, at first, just enough to make people shiver, and then it stayed. Wars fought far away, once explained with clean, confident language, no longer resembled a clear mission. On maps, the arrow still pointed forward. On television, the news still spoke of strategy and objectives. But in the minds of those watching, the question had changed. It was no longer, when will we win? It became, where are we going? The gap between promises and reality began to show thin, but sharp as a blade. The news itself shifted its place in everyday life. The television still turned on each night, but attention was no longer whole. People listened more carefully, more slowly, and with more doubt. Two channels told two different stories. Two headlines described opposing truths. Reality, once believed to be singular, now appeared with many faces. And when truth no longer stood still, people were forced to choose where to place their faith. For many, the government was no longer the sole voice of truth. Not because it had suddenly become dishonest, but because the world had grown more complex than any single voice could contain. Major decisions were made far away, in formal language, yet their consequences landed close inside letters, phone calls, and empty chairs at the dinner table. And then, doubt entered daily life. In a morning cafe, two strangers sat side by side, steam rising from their cups. The conversation began with the weather, then drifted toward last night's news. Voices lowered, eyes glanced quickly around the room. Not out of fear but caution. People learned to speak more slowly, to choose words more carefully, as if every sentence carried the power to crack something fragile. In living rooms, sofas became witnesses to long debates. Fathers and sons, husbands and wives, lifelong friends, people who once agreed on so much, now found themselves standing on opposite sides of the same question. No one shouted at first. It began with reason. But reason, when pressed against fear, easily turns into a weapon. At the dinner table, food grew cold as conversations grew hot. Sentences were left unfinished. Disappointed glances lingered. Silences grew heavier than accusation. People weren't arguing to win. They argued because they were afraid that if they were wrong, everything they had believed in might collapse with it. Communities that once felt tightly bound began to develop invisible lines. No walls were built, no signs were posted. Yet everyone sensed it. Certain topics were best avoided, certain questions shouldn't be pushed too far. Politeness settled over anxiety, like a thin coat of paint covering a crack in the wall. And within that doubt, a paradox formed. Americans still loved their country. They still believed in its ideals. But they no longer believed there was only one path to reach them. Each person carried their own map, and the fear that their map might be leading them in the wrong direction. Not because people hated one another, but because each feared that they were being led the wrong way. A nation long accustomed to leading the world now had to turn inward. The spotlight no longer shone outward. The certainty that every step was being watched and trusted by the world was gone. For the first time in a long while, America stood before its own mirror, not to adjust its posture, but to look more closely at the scratches that had been there all along. Americans began to question their own history. Not the simple questions once answered neatly in textbooks, but slow, heavy, uncomfortable ones. About wars once celebrated in heroic language, were they truly as noble as they were told? About moments of victory, was the cost ever fully acknowledged? About familiar images of heroes, were their stories left behind the glow? In libraries, old books were reopened. Yellowed pages were no longer just memories, they became evidence. In classrooms, teachers began to speak more slowly, not because facts were missing, but because every fact now carried another question. Students no longer only took notes. They looked up, met the gaze, and asked back. In museums, people lingered longer before familiar artifacts, a military uniform, a photograph from the battlefield, a speech carved in stone. Objects that once inspired pride now stirred something else. Not quite shame, not quite regret, but complexity. History was no longer a straight line from right to right. It curved, doubled back, and sometimes contradicted itself. Americans began to re-examine the promises they had trusted. Promises of freedom for all, of equal opportunity, of each generation living better than the one before. The promises were still beautiful. But on closer inspection, people realized they had never been fully kept, not for lack of intention, but because reality is always more complicated than ideals. Some benefited more, some waited much longer. Some dreams arrived late or never arrived at all. And then the larger question emerged, quiet but persistent. Was America a story of perfection or a story of constant striving? Did strength mean never being wrong or having the courage to admit mistakes and correct them? Did leading the world mean always moving ahead or sometimes stopping, turning back, and asking where you had been? Not to erase the past. No crowds quietly pulling down statues in private rooms. No desire to wipe clean the pages already written. What Americans were seeking was not denial, but understanding. Understanding to place things where they belonged. Understanding to avoid repeating mistakes simply because they had once been wrapped in beautiful language. In slower, more careful conversations, history began to be spoken of like a member of the family. There were things to be proud of, things difficult to say aloud, but no pretending they didn't exist. History became something to face, not something to worship blindly. And in this inward journey, America did not find a single answer. Instead, it found many voices, many memories, many perspectives existing side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes completing one another. Not neat, not comfortable, but real, because in the end, when a nation dares to look back at itself, the most important question is not how great were we. It is who are we really? From the outside, the world saw a divided America. Bold headlines flashed across screens. Rapidly cut images, sharply contrasted. Words pulled out of context, repeated until they became symbols of conflict. From a distance, everything looked like a shattered picture, each fragment carrying its own color, refusing to fit neatly back together. But on the inside, it was a nation arguing with itself. Not simple hatred, not a desire to erase one another. It was the argument of people who shared the same house, yet were no longer sure how the furniture should be arranged. Everyone wanted to protect what they believed was right. And when right becomes fragile, voices naturally rise, gestures stiffen. Between security and freedom, Americans found themselves standing on a line that was hard to see. On one side was fear, quiet but persistent, that a single moment of neglect could allow tragedy to return. On the other was the memory of values once considered untouchable. Every step toward security seemed to pull freedom one step back. And every defense of freedom came with the question, are we safe enough? Between power and morality, the debate grew heavier. Power had long been a familiar language, clear, direct, effective. But morality does not follow commands. It asks uncomfortable questions. It demands that consequences be faced. In boardrooms and at dinner tables, people weighed the same dilemma. When is power necessary, and when does it become a burden? There was no universal measure, only imperfect choices. Between old beliefs and new realities, Americans felt the imbalance clearly. Old beliefs said every problem had a clear solution, that history moved forward in a straight line, that tomorrow would always be brighter than today. The new reality was more complicated. It carried overlapping stories, unintended outcomes, consequences stretching far beyond original intentions. Old beliefs did not disappear, but they were no longer enough to explain everything. In cities, public squares became meeting grounds for opposing voices. Banners were raised, slogans echoed. Yet between them were moments deeply human, two people standing side by side, disagreeing, but sharing a bottle of water. A conversation that began in tension and ended in respectful silence. These moments rarely made the news, but they existed steadfast. In the suburbs, community meetings lasted longer than usual. People no longer came just to listen, but to speak. To be heard. To try to understand why others saw things differently. It didn't always work. Some evenings ended in exhaustion. But exhaustion was not the same as surrender. Up close, division resembled a painful process of growth. When old answers no longer fit, people are forced to argue in order to reshape them. It was not an immediate sign of collapse. It was the sign of a society struggling to preserve what mattered most, while the world around it had already changed. And in that struggle, Americans began to recognize something difficult, but necessary, that not every disagreement can be resolved by a slogan, that not every problem yields to sheer will, that some questions require time, require trial and error, require listening, and require patience. And for the first time in modern history, Americans understood this. Not every question has a quick answer. Doubt did not weaken America. It forced America to slow down, to listen, to think, because sometimes a nation does not need more power. It needs the courage to ask itself where it is going. And perhaps that is how America continues to endure.